You're watching live coverage when the jury foreperson stands to deliver the verdict that will determine whether Wendy Osefo spends the next 2 decades behind bars. The courtroom fell into absolute silence as the jury foreperson rose to read the verdicts on all 16 charges against Wendy Osefo and her husband Eddie. The tension was palpable as spectators, media representatives, and both legal teams waited to hear the outcome of a trial that had captivated the reality TV world for months. Wendy sat perfectly still at the defense table, her expression carefully neutral as she prepared to hear whether the jury believed the prosecution's case or her defense team's arguments. The first verdict came swiftly and definitively. Guilty on count 1, insurance fraud in the first degree. The pattern continued relentlessly as the foreperson read through each charge. Guilty on count 2, guilty on count 3. By the time the foreperson reached the 7th count, it was clear the jury had rejected Wendy's defense entirely. All 7 felony charges resulted in guilty verdicts, along with guilty findings on the 9 misdemeanor charges related to filing false police reports and providing false information to insurance companies. Wendy's carefully maintained composure cracked as the reality of the verdict set in. Tears streamed down her face as she gripped the edge of the defense table, her attorneys placing supportive hands on her shoulders while maintaining their own professional demeanor. Eddie showed similar distress, his head dropping into his hands as guilty verdict after guilty verdict was read. The couple who had portrayed an image of success and education on reality television was now convicted of orchestrating a sophisticated fraud scheme. The jury had deliberated for 18 hours over 3 days before reaching their unanimous verdicts. Legal analysts following the trial had predicted the lengthy deliberation might indicate division among jurors, but the ultimate unanimity on all charges suggested that once jurors worked through the complex evidence, they found the prosecution's case overwhelming. Post-verdict interviews with jurors who agreed to speak with media revealed that the physical evidence of supposedly stolen items found in the home had been particularly convincing in establishing the fraud. The evidence presented during the 3-week trial had been extensive and damning. Prosecutors had systematically demonstrated that the burglary report was fabricated through testimony from security system experts, insurance investigators, and forensic analysts. The lack of any alarm activation or camera footage showing intruders was impossible to explain away. The discovery of supposedly stolen items still in the house during the search warrant execution provided physical proof that contradicted the couple's claims. Gazelle Bryant's testimony had been among the most dramatic moments of the trial. Her detailed account of conversations where Wendy had discussed financial desperation and plans to file fraudulent claims provided direct evidence of premeditation. While defense attorneys had attempted to discredit Gazelle by highlighting her inconsistent initial statements to investigators, jurors apparently found her testimony credible enough to support the prosecution's theory of the case. The insider perspective she provided on Wendy's state of mind and planning was difficult for the defense to overcome. Financial evidence showing the couple's mounting debts and the timeline of their insurance claims had established clear motive for the fraud. Prosecutors had painted a picture of a couple desperate to maintain the appearance of success for reality television, while drowning in financial obligations they couldn't meet through legitimate means. The narrative of image over integrity resonated with jurors who saw the fraud as a calculated attempt to deceive insurance companies for personal gain. The judge set a sentencing hearing for 6 weeks after the verdict, allowing time for pre-sentencing reports to be prepared and for both sides to present arguments about appropriate punishment. With 7 felony convictions, Wendy and Eddie faced potential sentences that could keep them imprisoned for decades. Maryland's sentencing guidelines for insurance fraud of this magnitude, combined with the aggravating factors of premeditation and multiple victims, suggested lengthy prison terms were likely. Legal experts estimated Wendy could receive anywhere from 10 to 20 years, with Eddie facing similar exposure. The immediate aftermath of the guilty verdicts revealed the human toll of the fraud scheme and its prosecution as Wendy's family reacted to the devastating outcome. Wendy's mother, who had attended every day of the trial in support of her daughter, broke down completely when the verdicts were read. Her anguished crying could be heard throughout the courtroom as she watched her daughter being convicted of serious felonies. The pain of a parent watching their child face decades in prison was visceral and heartbreaking, reminding observers that criminal cases affected entire families beyond just the defendants. Her grief was complicated by apparent shock that Wendy had actually committed the crimes, suggesting the family had believed in Wendy's innocence despite the evidence. Wendy's children, who had not been present in the courtroom during the verdict, would soon learn that their mother was facing years in prison. The impact on young children of having a parent incarcerated for extended periods was profound and lasting. They would grow up visiting their mother in prison, dealing with questions from peers about why their mom wasn't home, and carrying the stigma of having a parent who was a convicted felon. The family consequences of Wendy's choices extended far beyond her own punishment. Eddie's family members present in the courtroom showed similar distress at the verdicts. His parents had been supportive throughout the trial, maintaining belief that the couple was innocent of the charges. The guilty verdicts on all counts shattered that belief and forced them to confront that their son had participated in serious criminal activity. The family dynamics would be forever changed by the convictions, with relationships strained by the reality of what Eddie and Wendy had done. The judge ordered both defendants to surrender their passports immediately and set bond conditions for their release pending sentencing. While they would remain free for the 6 weeks until sentencing, they were required to wear electronic monitoring devices and were prohibited from leaving the state. The restrictions acknowledged the flight risk posed by defendants facing lengthy prison sentences, though the judge apparently believed the monitoring was sufficient to ensure they would appear for sentencing. Victim impact statements would be heard at the sentencing hearing, with representatives from the insurance companies that had been defrauded preparing to detail the costs and consequences of the fraud. While insurance fraud might seem like a victimless crime to some, the companies would emphasize that fraud increased costs for all policyholders and represented theft from legitimate businesses. The insurance investigators who had worked on the case were also preparing statements about the resources consumed investigating the false claims. The defense attorneys addressed media outside the courthouse, announcing plans to appeal the convictions while acknowledging the disappointing outcome. They characterized the verdicts as wrong and suggested the jury had been swayed by emotion and bias against reality TV personalities rather than fairly evaluating the evidence. The statement about appeal was standard procedure after convictions, though legal experts noted that the strength of the evidence made successful appeals unlikely. The prosecution team held their own press conference celebrating the verdicts and emphasizing that insurance fraud was serious criminal activity that would be prosecuted aggressively. The lead prosecutor thanked the jury for their careful consideration of complex evidence and expressed satisfaction that justice had been served. The statement sent a message to others who might consider similar fraud schemes that the consequences were real and severe. Media coverage of the verdict was immediate and extensive, with news outlets across the country reporting on the conviction of the Real Housewives star on fraud charges. The story dominated entertainment news and created renewed interest in the case among people who hadn't followed the trial closely. The conviction transformed the narrative from allegations to confirmed criminal activity, removing any remaining ambiguity about whether Wendy had actually committed the fraud. Social media exploded with reactions to the verdict, with opinions ranging from satisfaction that justice had been served to sympathy for Wendy's children who would suffer for their parents' choices. The comments revealed deep divisions about how much sympathy convicted criminals deserved and whether the potential 20-year sentence was appropriate or excessive for insurance fraud. The debates played out across multiple platforms as people processed the outcome and its implications. The moment Kayarna Stewart had been waiting for since she first raised questions about Wendy Osefo's character and behavior had finally arrived. Complete and total vindication through guilty verdicts on every single charge. Kayarna's reaction video posted immediately after the verdicts was pure triumph. She had been right about Wendy being dishonest and criminal from the very beginning, despite facing criticism and accusations of being a hater. Every person who had defended Wendy and attacked Kayarna for her commentary now had to confront that Kayarna had been accurate in her assessments. The vindication was complete and public, establishing Kayarna as someone whose instincts about reality TV personalities were reliable. The content Kayarna produced analyzing the verdicts was comprehensive and celebratory. She reviewed the timeline of her commentary about Wendy, showing how she had questioned Wendy's finances, her lifestyle claims, and her overall authenticity long before the fraud was exposed. Each receipt demonstrated that Kayarna had recognized something was wrong with Wendy's image when others had accepted it at face value. The "I told you so" energy was unapologetic and earned. Kayarna specifically addressed people who had criticized her for being too harsh on Wendy or for making serious allegations without proof. She pointed out that she had been gathering information and observing patterns that indicated deception long before law enforcement got involved. Her willingness to question Wendy despite pushback had been vindicated by the jury's guilty verdicts. The message to her critics was clear. Maybe they should have listened instead of dismissing her observations as hate. Most satisfying for Kayarna was addressing Wendy's supporters, who had claimed she was just jealous of Wendy's education and success. The guilty verdicts proved that the education and success had been facades hiding criminal behavior and financial desperation. Kayarna had never been jealous. She had been accurate in recognizing that Wendy's image didn't match reality. The distinction between jealousy and perception was now undeniable. Kayarna also took victory laps regarding her claims about Ashley Darby and Giselle Bryant's involvement in or knowledge of the fraud scheme. While neither had been charged criminally, The investigation had confirmed they had connections to the fraud that Kiarna had suspected. Her track record of being right about multiple aspects of the case established her as someone whose commentary should be taken seriously, rather than dismissed as conspiracy theories. The growth of Kiarna's platform following the guilty verdicts was substantial. Her subscriber counts increased dramatically, as Seeping who had doubted her came to recognize her credibility. Brand partnerships and sponsorship opportunities emerged as companies saw value in associating with someone who had demonstrated accurate instincts and thorough research. The professional success that came from being right repeatedly transformed Kiarna's content creation from a side project into a viable career. Kiarna's message to other content creators and commentators was about the importance of trusting their instincts and doing thorough research rather than just accepting the narratives that public figures presented. Her success came from looking beyond the surface and asking questions that others weren't willing to ask. The approach had cost her some relationships and had generated criticism, but ultimately it had been vindicated by events. The emotional satisfaction Kiarna felt went beyond just being right about Wendy's criminal behavior. She had been advocating for truth and accountability in reality TV for years, often feeling like she was shouting into the void. The guilty verdicts validated that her work mattered, and that holding public figures accountable for deception served an important purpose. The vindication was professional, but also deeply personal. And now viewers who had dismissed Kiarna as unnecessarily harsh or obsessed with bringing people down found themselves asking an uncomfortable question. When someone's criticism of a public figure turns out to be completely accurate, does that mean we should reconsider our tendency to defend celebrities against critics? The insurance companies that had been defrauded by Wendy and Eddie's scheme expressed satisfaction with the guilty verdicts, while emphasizing the broader costs of insurance fraud to businesses and consumers. Representatives from both insurance companies that had paid out on Wendy's fraudulent claims issued statements describing the impact of the fraud on their operations. Beyond the immediate financial loss of the funds paid out, the companies had invested substantial resources in investigating the suspicious claims and cooperating with law enforcement. The total cost to the companies exceeded the amount of the fraudulent claims themselves when all investigation and legal expenses were included. The statements emphasized that insurance fraud wasn't a victimless crime, despite perceptions to the contrary. When people filed failed claims and received payouts based on lies, those costs were ultimately passed on to all policyholders through higher premiums. The companies framed Wendy's fraud as theft not just from them but from every honest person who paid insurance premiums. The narrative challenged any sympathy for Wendy by emphasizing the broader harm caused by her actions. Insurance industry organizations used the case as an example in their ongoing efforts to combat fraud. The sophistication of Wendy's scheme, including filing with multiple companies and padding claims with items that had been previously refunded, demonstrated the techniques fraudsters used to maximize their illegal gains. Educational materials about recognizing fraud red flags would incorporate lessons from this case to help investigators identify similar schemes in the future. The insurance companies announced plans to pursue civil recovery actions against Wendy, Eddie, and potentially others who had been connected to the fraud. Civil cases allowed them to seek not just return of the fraudulently obtained funds, but also punitive damages and recovery of investigation costs. The judgments from civil cases could amount to millions of dollars, creating financial obligations that would follow the defendants for the rest of their lives even after they completed any prison sentences. Consumer advocacy groups noted that the case highlighted the importance of insurance fraud prosecution. While the criminal justice system was often overwhelmed with violent crimes and drug offenses, economic crimes like fraud caused substantial harm and deserved serious attention from prosecutors. The lengthy prison sentences Wendy and Eddie faced sent a message that fraud would be treated as the serious crime it was rather than as a minor offense. The technology aspects of the case attracted attention from security companies and insurers. The fact that Wendy and Eddie's own home security systems had provided the evidence that disproved their burglary claims highlighted the importance of surveillance technology in fraud detection. However, it also raised questions about how sophisticated fraudsters might attempt to circumvent or manipulate security systems in future schemes. The case would inform security protocols and investigation techniques going forward. Industry analysts predicted that the high-profile nature of Wendy's case would likely deter some potential insurance fraudsters who saw the serious consequences she faced. However, they acknowledged that fraud remained a persistent problem driven by financial desperation and the mistaken belief that insurance companies had unlimited money and wouldn't miss relatively small payouts. Education about both the likelihood of getting caught and the severity of penalties remained important prevention strategies. The insurance investigators who had worked on the case expressed professional satisfaction with the guilty verdicts. Their patient documentation of the inconsistencies and impossibilities in Wendy's story had provided the foundation for the criminal prosecution. The recognition that thorough investigation techniques could uncover even sophisticated fraud schemes validated their work and provided lessons for handling future cases. People following the case started reflecting on something they hadn't fully considered before. When someone commits fraud against a faceless corporation, does the fact that all customers ultimately pay for that fraud through higher prices make it a crime against everyone? Ashley Darby and Gazelle Bryant found themselves in the uncomfortable position of having avoided criminal charges while watching someone they had been connected to receive guilty verdicts on all counts. Ashley's public statement following the verdicts was carefully crafted to express appropriate concern while maintaining distance from Wendy's criminal activity. She stated that she hoped justice had been served and that the legal system had worked as intended. The neutral tone avoided seeming celebratory about someone else's conviction, while also not suggesting she believed Wendy was innocent. Her legal team had clearly advised her to say nothing that could be interpreted as either defending fraud or gloating about escaping charges herself. Behind the scenes, sources indicated Ashley was experiencing relief mixed with lingering anxiety. While she hadn't been charged, the fact that her connection to the fraud had been publicly examined meant her reputation would always carry the taint of having been involved somehow. The payment she received from Wendy and the communications between them during the relevant time period remained public knowledge that would follow her even though prosecutors had decided not to charge her with crimes. Gazelle's response was similarly measured, but slightly more detailed. She acknowledged that she had provided testimony during the trial and that the process had been difficult. Her statement suggested that being forced to testify against someone she had considered a friend was painful, but necessary. The framing positioned her as someone who had done the right thing by cooperating with prosecutors even though it meant revealing embarrassing information about her own judgment and failure to intervene. The question of whether Ashley and Gazelle deserved to avoid charges while Wendy faced 20 years remained controversial. Some observers observed that their roles had been significantly less culpable than Wendy's and that not charging them was appropriate. Others felt that anyone who knew about the fraud and failed to report it, or who potentially benefited from it, should face consequences. The debate revealed different philosophical approaches to criminal justice and accountability. Both women faced ongoing civil litigation risks, even without criminal charges. The insurance companies pursuing recovery could potentially name them as defendants in civil cases if evidence suggested they had played roles in the fraud or had benefited from it. Civil liability had a lower burden of proof than criminal cases, meaning they could face financial judgments without the criminal conviction standard of beyond reasonable doubt being met. The professional consequences for both Ashley and Gazelle remained significant despite avoiding criminal prosecution. Their association with the fraud case had damaged their brands and limited their opportunities. Companies were hesitant to partner with people who had been publicly connected to serious criminal activity even if they hadn't been charged. The reputational harm created economic consequences that would persist for years. Their relationships with other RHEP cast members were permanently affected by their connections to Wendy's fraud case. Some housewives maintained friendships with them while others distanced themselves, creating fractures in the cast dynamics that would influence future seasons. The trust that reality TV required to create compelling drama was complicated by the reality that actual crimes had been committed and some cast members had been connected to them. The decision by Bravo about whether to keep Ashley and Gazelle on the show remained contentious. The network had determined that their lack of criminal charges provided sufficient justification to maintain their employment. But that decision faced criticism from victim advocates and some viewers who felt they should face professional consequences even without legal convictions. The controversy highlighted tensions between entertainment value and ethical responsibility. Ashley and Gazelle both attempted to move forward with their lives and careers, while living with the knowledge that they had been connected to serious criminal activity. The psychological toll of having been investigated, of knowing they had been close to potentially facing charges themselves, and of seeing Wendy convicted created ongoing stress and anxiety. Therapy and legal counseling helped them process the experience and develop strategies for managing the lasting effects. And observers watching Ashley and Gazelle navigate life after Wendy's conviction found themselves pondering. When the legal system determines someone isn't criminally guilty but the court of public opinion sees them as morally culpable, which judgment matters more in determining whether justice has been served? The impact of Wendy Osefo's conviction on her family extended far beyond the courtroom verdict to affect every aspect of their daily lives and future prospects. Wendy's children faced the devastating reality that their mother would likely be absent for a substantial portion of their childhood and adolescence. If Wendy received a sentence near the 20-year maximum, her youngest child would be an adult before she was released from prison. The developmental stages they would navigate without their mother present, adolescence, first relationships, graduations, college decisions, would be shaped by her absence and the stigma of having a parent in prison for fraud. The family's financial situation was catastrophic. Wendy's income from reality TV, speaking engagements, and her academic career had been the primary source of family support. With all those income streams eliminated by her conviction, and with mounting legal fees and eventual restitution obligations, the family faced potential bankruptcy. Eddie's employment prospects were similarly damaged by his conviction, making it unclear how they would support their children even if he received a lighter sentence than Wendy. Wendy's parents and extended family struggled with the shame and stigma of having a family member convicted of serious felonies. In their community and social circles, the conviction became defining information about their family. Some relationships were strained or broken by the scandal, while others deepened as people rallied to support the children who were innocent victims of their parents' choices. The family dynamics would never return to what they had been before the fraud. The educational implications for Wendy were particularly ironic given how much she had emphasized her 4 degrees. Her academic career was over, with the university having terminated her employment after the conviction. The degrees she had worked so hard to earn and had used as the foundation of her identity would now be permanently associated with criminal fraud. Future students studying cases of academic fraud and ethical failures would likely encounter her story as a cautionary tale. Eddie's relationship with Wendy faced enormous strain as they both confronted the reality that their choices had destroyed their family's future. While they had committed the crimes together, the stress of facing lengthy sentences, managing the impact on their children, and dealing with financial ruin tested their marriage in ways that most relationships couldn't survive. Divorce, while both facing prison time, was complicated, but some experts predicted it was likely given the circumstances. The couple's friend networks largely evaporated after the conviction. People who had been part of their social circles distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with convicted felons or to deal with the complications of maintaining friendships with people heading to prison. The social isolation added to the emotional toll of the conviction and left them with limited support systems during an incredibly difficult time. Wendy's mother's mental health had deteriorated significantly throughout the trial and was further damaged by the guilty verdicts. The stress of watching her daughter be convicted and face decades in prison created anxiety and depression that required professional treatment. Her role in supporting her grandchildren while both parents potentially faced incarceration added practical burdens to her emotional distress. The impact on the children's education and social lives was immediate and profound. Other parents whispered about them at school events. Children asked intrusive questions about their parents being criminals, and teachers struggled with how to handle the situation sensitively while maintaining normal expectations. The stigma of having parents convicted of fraud would follow the children throughout their educational careers and potentially affect college admissions and future opportunities. Mental health support for the children became a critical need as they processed the trauma of their parents being convicted of crimes and facing prison. Therapy helped them understand that they bore no responsibility for their parents' choices, and that the love their parents had for them was real even if their judgment and behavior had been terrible. The long-term psychological effects would require ongoing support throughout their development. And people watching this family's complete destruction found themselves confronting a painful reality. When parents commit crimes and go to prison, the harshest punishment often falls on their children who did nothing wrong but will carry the consequences of their parents' choices for the rest of their lives. 6 weeks after the guilty verdicts, the sentencing hearing brought the legal proceedings to their conclusion and determined how long Wendy and Eddie Osefo would spend behind bars for their fraud scheme. The courtroom was packed with media, observers, and family members as both sides presented their arguments about appropriate sentences. The prosecution argued for sentences near the maximum allowed under sentencing guidelines, emphasizing the sophistication of the fraud, the premeditation, the multiple victims, and the complete lack of remorse shown by the defendants throughout the process. They characterized Wendy as someone who had every advantage in life but had chosen criminal fraud over honest work when faced with financial pressure. The defense presented mitigation arguments focusing on Wendy's lack of prior criminal history, her contributions to her community through education and media work, and the impact that lengthy incarceration would have on her young children. They argued that substantial prison time was appropriate but that sentences toward the lower end of the guidelines would serve justice while not unnecessarily destroying the family. The arguments had to acknowledge guilt while attempting to generate some sympathy from the judge. Victim impact statements from the insurance companies detailed not just the financial costs, but the broader impact of fraud on their operations and all policyholders. Representatives emphasized that fraud wasn't a victimless crime and that Wendy's actions had real consequences for honest people. The statements were clinical but effective in establishing that the fraud had caused genuine harm that deserved serious punishment. Wendy's statement to the court before sentencing was emotional, but stopped short of fully accepting responsibility. She apologized to her family, her children, and those affected by her actions while still suggesting that circumstances had pressured her into poor decisions. The lack of complete ownership of her choices likely didn't help her case with the judge, but reflected ongoing difficulty accepting the full magnitude of her criminal behavior. The judge's sentencing remarks were pointed and focused on the seriousness of the fraud and the message that needed to be sent about such crimes. The judge noted that Wendy had used her education and position of trust to plan and execute sophisticated fraud, making her behavior more culpable rather than less. The betrayal of the trust that education and professional status created warranted significant punishment rather than leniency. The sentences handed down were substantial, but not at the maximum range. Wendy received 15 years in prison on the most serious felony charge, with concurrent sentences on the other counts. Eddie received a similar sentence. The judge recommended they serve their time at facilities that would allow contact with their children, acknowledging the innocent victims of the defendant's choices. With good behavior, they might be released after serving about 12 years, but the reality was that a significant portion of their lives would be spent incarcerated. The immediate aftermath of sentencing saw Wendy and Eddie taken into custody to begin serving their sentences. The transition from free individuals to prisoners was jarring and final, marking the complete destruction of the lives they had built through their fraud scheme. Their children's visit schedule would be determined by the prison system's policies and the locations where they were ultimately housed. The media coverage of the sentencing emphasized the dramatic fall from reality TV fame to lengthy prison sentences. Commentary focused on how the pressure to maintain appearances on television and social media had driven successful, educated people to make catastrophic choices. The case became a cautionary tale about the dangers of valuing image over integrity, and of allowing financial pressure to override ethical judgment. Kiarna Stewart provided final commentary on the sentencing, expressing satisfaction that justice had been served while acknowledging the tragedy of the situation for Wendy's children. Her coverage remained focused on accountability and the importance of recognizing that choices had consequences. The vindication was complete, but even she acknowledged the human cost was significant. The Real Housewives of Potomac moved forward without Wendy, with the show incorporating references to her conviction and impediment to storylines while focusing on the remaining cast. The franchise had survived cast members facing legal troubles before, and would continue, though the severity of Wendy's crimes and sentences made this case unique in the reality TV landscape. The insurance companies began their civil recovery efforts immediately after sentencing, seeking to collect restitution and damages from Wendy, Eddie, and potentially others connected to the fraud. The financial judgments would ensure that even after completing their prison sentences, the couple would face decades of economic consequences from their criminal choices. The criminal justice system had worked as intended, with defendants being investigated, charged, tried, convicted, and sentenced for serious fraud crimes. Whether justice had truly been served remained a question of perspective. The legal system had functioned properly, but the broader destruction caused by the fraud extended far beyond what any court sentence could address, and people who had followed this entire saga from the first allegations through the final sentencing couldn't help but reflect on a profound truth. When the pressure to maintain perfect images on social media and reality TV drives people to commit serious crimes, everyone loses. But the innocent family members who had no choice in any of it pay the highest price of all.